Imagine a tiny hidden flaw right there in the very foundation of the internet. And for over 2 years, it's silently bleeding out your most sensitive data. That's basically what happened with Heartbleed. It was, well, a cybersecurity incident that sent massive shockwaves through the digital world back in April 2014. In this deep dive, we're going to unpack exactly what Heartbleed was, how such a subtle, really subtle flaw could have such a huge impact, and maybe most importantly, the crucial lessons it taught us about online security, open source software, and, the constant vigilance needed to protect our digital lives. So, yeah, get ready to go behind that little padlock icon in your browser.
Okay, so to really get Heartbleed, I think we first need to talk about OpenSSL. For a lot of people, it's kind of this unsung hero of internet encryption, right? It's an open source toolkit. It gives us the secure socket layer, SSL, and transport layer security, TLS implementations. Basically, think of it as the engine securing almost everything you do online. Your web browsing, that little HTTPS lock that's often OpenSSL, and your emails, instant messaging, even VPNs. Lots of them rely on it.
Absolutely. And what's really key here, I think, is that Heartbleed wasn't a fundamental flaw in the protocol in TLS itself, which is the standard. Instead, it was a security bug, specifically a buffer overread flaw. And it was within OpenSSL's specific implementation of a part of TLS called the Heartbeat extension, a buffer overread. Well, it's basically a programming mistake where the program reads more data from a memory spot than it's supposed to. It kind of spills over into the next bit of memory. And that's why other TLS libraries, NetTLS, Mozilla NSS, Microsoft's own TLS library, they weren't affected. The problem was unique to OpenSSL's code.
Right. It wasn't the standard, just how they wrote the code for it. And this wasn't just a quick bug, was it? It stuck around for a while.
Oh, yeah. A long while.
The flaw was actually introduced into the OpenSSL software way back in December 2011, and the first vulnerable version, OpenSSL 1.0.1, shipped in March 2012. It stayed in there through several versions, right up to 1.0.1f, and even a beta release, 1.0.12 beta 1, had it. It wasn't until April 7th, 2014 that it was publicly disclosed and, thankfully, fixed on the same day.
And that specific part it exploited, the Heartbeat extension. Its actual purpose was pretty benign. It was proposed as a standard RFC 6520 back in February 2012, mainly to keep secure connections alive. So you wouldn't need these frequent computationally expensive renegotiations, just a way to check the connection was still healthy. The basic function is simple. One computer sends a Heartbeat request. It has a payload, maybe just some text, and it tells the other computer the length of that payload. The receiving computer is just supposed to send exactly the same payload back, like an echo. A Heartbeat response confirms everything's still okay.
Okay, let's really unpack the vulnerability then. The core weakness, you said, was a missing bounds check in the code. I like this analogy. Imagine you ask someone, hey, send me back the 4-letter word bird. Simple, right? But then what if you told them that bird was actually a 500-letter word?
That's a perfect way to put it. That's exactly how the exploit worked. An attacker would send this specially crafted Heartbeat request to a vulnerable server. The request would have a tiny actual payload, maybe just 1 byte, like you said, but it would lie about its length. It would claim it was much, much bigger, usually the maximum allowed, which is 65,535 bytes or 64 kilobytes. And the vulnerable OpenSSL code, it just trusted it. It didn't check if the claimed length matched the actual payload size. So it would allocate a memory buffer for the response based on that claimed huge length. Then instead of just copying the tiny actual payload it received, the server will start copying that payload and then just keep copying whatever happened to be next to it into the server's memory. It would keep going until it filled up the buffer size the attacker claimed up to 64 kilobytes. So this response buffer, now containing the original tiny payload plus a big chunk of the server's private memory, potentially very sensitive stuff, gets sent back to the attacker. And what's really insidious here is that the attacker could just do this again and again. And again. Just keep asking for these heartbeats with fake lengths, slicing off different 64 KB chunks of memory each time. And the worst part, from the server's perspective, everything looked normal. This attack left no apparent evidence in the log files. It was like a ghost. Made it incredibly difficult, maybe impossible, to know if a machine had been compromised before the bug was found.
That's terrifying, a silent, invisible theft happening over and over. So the mechanism is clear lie about the length, get back extra memory. But what exactly was in that memory? What kind of treasures could an attacker actually steal when that memory started to bleed? Was it just random junk?
Oh, it could be far, far worse than junk. It could be, and sometimes was, absolutely catastrophic data. The biggest prize, the absolute crown jewels, was the primary key material. We're talking about the server's private SSL TLS keys. The secret keys used to encrypt everything. If an attacker got those, They could potentially decrypt past recorded traffic, future traffic, basically read everything, and even impersonate the server convincingly, set up fake versions of websites. Then you had secondary key material. Think usernames and passwords that users typed in that were just sitting in memory.
Yeah.
Also, the actual protected content itself, personal details, financial information, private emails, documents, whatever the server was handling. Things like session cookies and tokens, too, those little things that keep you logged into websites. Attackers could grab those and hijack active user sessions. And finally, just collateral data, things like memory addresses, other technical details that could help plan future attacks. And we know this wasn't just theoretical. Just days after Heartbleed was revealed, Cloudflare ran their Heartbleed challenge. And yeah, researchers proved you could actually extract a server's private TLS key this way. The worst-case scenario was very real.
Wow. The scale, then. The potential scale was just staggering. I remember reading back when it was disclosed in April 2014, something like 17%, that's around 500,000 of the internet's secure web servers, certified ones, were thought to be vulnerable. And some estimates went even higher, maybe up to 2/3 of all web servers using OpenSSL. It felt like the floor just dropped out from under the internet for a few days there. Everyone was scrambling.
They really were. It was controlled chaos, maybe just chaos. The reaction from security experts was immediate and, frankly, panicked. The Electronic Frontier Foundation, Ars Technica security guru Bruce Schneier, they all called it catastrophic. Schneier famously rated it an 11 on a scale of 1 to 10. That quote really stuck, didn't it?
It really did.
And Joseph Steinberg over at Forbes, he called it potentially the worst vulnerability found since commercial traffic began to flow on the internet. Just massive impact potential.
And it wasn't just potential. We saw real-world exploits almost immediately. The Canada Revenue Agency, the CRA, they reported that social insurance numbers, like social security numbers for 900 taxpayers, were stolen, apparently through a Heartbleed exploit during just a 6-hour window on April 8th, 2014. The student was later charged for that. And in the UK, the parenting site Mumsnet, they had user accounts hijacked, the CEO was impersonated, all traced back to Heartbleed. And then later, August 2014, Community Health Systems, a big US hospital group, had data compromised 4.5 million patient records. Hackers apparently got in using Heartbleed to steal security keys.
Exactly. And another point here, which sometimes gets overlooked, is that it wasn't just servers attacking clients could be attacked too. There was a thing called reverse Heartbleed, because Heartbleed affected vulnerable clients as well as servers. If your device, say your phone or computer, was using a vulnerable version of OpenSSL, then a malicious server could send a bad heartbeat request to you and potentially read data from your device's memory. This reverse Heartbleed potentially affected millions of apps, including an estimated 50 million devices running Android version 4.1.1 at the time.
So your phone could have been leaking data out to a bad server. Wow.
Yep, it worked both ways.
Yeah. So this wasn't just about big websites. It was truly everywhere. The bug hit a huge range of systems. Software applications people use every day, HP server tools, FileMaker, LibreOffice, Logmin, McAfee products, MySQL connectors, WinSCP, VMware, the list goes on. And operating systems and firmware, too. Various Linux versions, Debian, Red Hat, Ubuntu, CentOS, Amazon Linux, Android 4.1.1, like you said. Firmware for some Apple airport routers, Cisco and Juniper network gear, pfSense firewalls, DDWRT router firmware, even Western Digital MyCloud storage devices. Basically, if it connected to the internet and used that version of OpenSSL, it was probably vulnerable.
Which brings up a really tricky question that surfaced almost immediately. Was this known about before? Could it have been exploited before April 2014? There was a lot of speculation, particularly around the U.S. National Security Agency, the NSA. Did they know about it and maybe use it for years? The NSA denied it, flat out. But some researchers digging through old network logs found activity patterns that suggested some attackers might have been using the flaw for maybe 5 months or even longer before the public announcement. And because the attack, as we said, leaves no clear trace in standard logs.
Right, the ghost problem.
Exactly. The prudent advice became, assume your vulnerable systems have already been compromised. You just couldn't be sure they hadn't.
So fixing this thing, it must have been an absolutely frantic, high-stakes race against time for everyone. The fix itself, OpenSSL version 1.0.1g, was developed incredibly quickly by Bodo Muller and Adam Langley at Google, and it was released on April 7th, 2014, the very same day the bug was announced to the world. Talk about pressure.
Incredible turnaround, really. And the fix itself, conceptually, was pretty straightforward. It simply introduced that proper bounds check that was missing from the Heartbeat code. Basically, the updated OpenSSL was taught to check. Does the length the requester claims for the payload actually match the amount of data they sent? If there's a mismatch, if they lied about the length, the updated code just ignores the message or flags an error. And crucially, it stops copying memory beyond the actual payload. That single check eliminated the buffer overread, stopped the bleeding. There was also another way to fix it. You can recompile OpenSSL with a specific setting. Dopin's also no heartbeats, which just turned off the heartbeat feature entirely. No heartbeat, no heartbleed.
Okay, so the code fix was simple, add the check. But you hinted earlier, the actual cleanup for organizations wasn't so simple, right? They couldn't just update the software and call it a day. What else did they absolutely have to do?
Well, absolutely not. Updating was just step one, and even that wasn't trivial. You had to patch the vulnerable systems, yes. Update OpenSSL to 1.0.1G or later. But then you had to restart everything using the old vulnerable library, web servers, email servers, VPNs. For some systems, especially those where OpenSSL was baked in, that might mean rebooting the whole machine, a huge operational task. But that was just the beginning, because you had to assume the worst. Step 2, regenerate keys and reissue certificates. You had to assume your private SSL TLS keys might have been stolen, treat them as compromised. So, generate brand new keys, get new SSL certificates issued by the certificate authorities, the CAs. And then, critically, you had to revoke the old certificates, tell browsers and systems not to trust them anymore. Massive coordination needed there. Step 3, invalidate session keys and cookies. Kick everyone off and make them log in again, basically, to kill any sessions hijacked using stolen cookies. Step 4, change passwords. All user passwords, all administrator passwords for affected services. Assume they could have been scraped from memory. Force resets. And you, as a user, had to wait until the service confirmed they were patched before changing your password. Otherwise, the new one could leak too.
What a mess.
A huge mess. And finally, step 5. Try to assess the impact. Do forensics. But again, with no logs. Extremely difficult. It was a nightmare remediation process.
So looking back, Heartbleed was this incredibly painful but maybe necessary wake-up call, wasn't it? It fundamentally reshaped how we think about cybersecurity and, maybe more importantly, exposed this massive failure of risk analysis on a global scale. We just hadn't realized how fragile some core pieces were.
That's exactly right. It threw a harsh spotlight on several systemic issues. And maybe the biggest shock wasn't even the technical bug itself, but the human element behind it. The underfunding of critical open source projects, finding out that OpenSSL, this library securing, a massive chunk of the internet, was maintained by just a handful of volunteers, and only one of them worked full-time on it, with donations around maybe $2,000 a year. It was staggering.
$2,000 to secure potentially trillions in commerce and data.
Right. Dan Kaminsky, the security researcher, had that great quote, "We're building the most important technologies for the global economy on shockingly underfunded infrastructure." Heartbleed proved him right. It also exposed really inadequate code review and testing practices. I mean, this bug, a relatively simple buffer overread from a forgotten check, sat there unnoticed for over 2 years in critical code. That just screamed a lack of thorough testing, security audits, basic code hygiene, really. And finally, it did bring more attention to the potential risks of using memory-unsafe languages like C for critical infrastructure. C gives you a lot of power, but it doesn't automatically prevent things like reading memory out of bounds. The programmer has to be vigilant, and in this case, that check was missed.
But thankfully, it wasn't all bad news in the long run. The crisis actually spurred some really positive changes. One huge one was the creation of the Core Infrastructure Initiative, the CII. This was a multi-million-dollar project, launched by the Linux Foundation right after Heartbleed hit in April 2014. Funded by big tech companies, Amazon, Google, IBM, Microsoft, and others, specifically to provide funds to critical elements of the global information infrastructure. And guess who was the first recipient?
Had to be OpenSSL, right?
Exactly. OpenSSL got funding, finally. Google also went on to establish Project Zero. That's their elite team of security researchers who proactively hunt for these zero-day vulnerabilities, flaws no one else knows about yet, trying to find them before the bad guys do. And beyond those big initiatives, the whole industry seemed to sharpen up its act a bit. More emphasis on thorough code audits, on really validating input, never trusting data coming in, understanding dependencies better, and definitely on having plans for rapid patching and response. It also really pushed the adoption of perfect forward secrecy, or PFS.
Oh, yes, PFS.
Yeah.
That became crucial.
Right, because PFS means that even if someone did steal your server's main long-term private key later on, they still couldn't go back and decrypt old conversations they might have recorded. Each session gets its own temporary key. A massive improvement against this kind of retroactive decryption threat.
Definitely. All positive steps.
Yeah.
But there's a lingering challenge. Despite all the lessons, Heartbleed shadow, those long-term risks, they persist. Even now, 10 years later, in 2024, reports from tools like Shodan show that thousands, maybe tens of thousands, of internet-connected devices are still vulnerable to Heartbleed.
Still, after all this time.
Still, old servers, embedded devices, things that just never got patched and are still running out there.
Yeah.
It highlights the massive ongoing problem of patching legacy systems and the sheer difficulty of securing everything that's connected.
So Heartbleed, it remains this stark reminder, a really painful but necessary wake-up call. It fundamentally changed cybersecurity practices, sure, but maybe more importantly, it raised awareness for millions of ordinary people like you listening about the hidden gears and sometimes hidden dangers of the internet we rely on.
Absolutely. And maybe a final thought to leave people with. Heartbleed came down to a single missing line of code, a bounds check. In a critical piece of open source software, we know memory safety issues, like buffer overflows, still dominate lists of top software vulnerabilities today. We know many critical digital components are still maintained by surprisingly small, sometimes under-resourced teams. So the question is, what fundamental shifts in how we develop software, how we fund it, how we secure this foundational technology, what shifts might still be needed to prevent the next Heartbleed level event from quietly starting to bleed out data right now, somewhere we haven't found yet? And maybe, what role do you, even as a user, play in that? By understanding these systems, by advocating for better security, for supporting the projects that underpin our digital world.
Some important questions to ponder. We really hope this deep dive has helped you feel a bit more informed about those hidden gears of internet security and maybe appreciate what it takes to try and keep them running smoothly and safely.